This video was recorded from a presentation or slides advanced with a click. During the video, you will be asked to do some actions. At that time, you must put the video in pause, do what you're asked to, and then hit the play button again.
In this presentation, we will review the concept of chunking in the context of teaching and learning interventions. For some of you, maybe this concept has not a clear meaning. By the end of this presentation, our goal is that you should be able to explain the concept of chunking and give different examples of it. This goal brings us to our objectives, and these are that you should be able to apply the concept of chunking to organizing a slide, segmenting a lecture, building lesson blocks, and organizing a course. Let's start by defining chunking. Chunking is grouping pieces of information in a meaningful way that will make it easier to understand, memorize, and recall. There are many daily examples where you already are using chunking. The first one is phone numbers. Very few of us would try to memorize this number as 1-800-555-1212. Most of us would do what the second phone is doing, 1-800-555-1212. We also do chunking when we write. Even though we sometimes receive emails like the one highlighted in yellow, we can clearly realize that the formatting of the one at the bottom makes it more easy to understand, memorize, and recall. Before moving to the next slide, take some time to appreciate the big difference it makes on understanding on how we present information. On this example, I would like you to look at the graphics in the slide for 15 seconds and then move to the next slide. You will be asked to draw what you remember. Okay, at this time, I will ask you to take a piece of paper and draw what you remember. When ready, go to the next slide. Compare your drawing with the original. How did you do? I would bet you left out some figures and that they are not all in the place they're supposed to be. Frustrating, isn't it? Well, keep this feeling in mind, because this is what our students feel when our slide is not well organized. Please move to the next slide now. Take a look at how we present the same graphics. Nicer to see, aren't they? Why is it? Because we organized information in a way it's easier to understand, memorize, and recall. Please put this assumption to a test. Memorize what you see and go to the next slide. Again, take a piece of paper and draw what you remember. When ready, go to the next slide. Compare your work with the original. I would bet you did much better. Did you? Sure you did. So, what do all these examples of chunking have in common? In all of them, we have grouped pieces of information in a way that they are more easy to memorize, retrieve, and understand. So, with the phone, instead of remembering 11 numbers, we only must remember 4 chunks. With the email, we converted 46 pieces of information in 7 meaningful chunks. Finally, with the drawing, we went from handling 16 pieces of information to 4. Why is chunking such a great help? Why the same information presented in different ways is easier to handle? Let's look for the answer in how memory works. For learning to take place, we must bring into our memory what we want to learn. What we learn will be stored in long-term memory. That will be entering through our working memory. When learning and putting what we learned into practice, there is a continuous movement between long-term and working memory. Processing theory tells us about the limited capacity of working memory, and that it can handle only about 5 to 9 chunks or pieces of information at a time. If we can only handle 5 pieces of information at a time, what can we do if we need to handle more than that, as it is usually the case? The secret is grouping pieces of information in a meaningful way. Whether it's a slide, a lesson, or a course, grouping is the answer. Let's see now some practical applications. Some time ago, one of my young doctors had to prepare a lecture on LASIK. As I always keep telling them not to forget to include objectives in their presentation, she finally came up with the following slide. I said, "I think there are too many. Try to bring them down to 3. She said, "But all of them are important." So I said, "Okay, keep them all, but try to present the slide with only 3 pieces of information." So she went back, gave it some thought, and came back with the following slide. Before going on to the next slide, give some thought on how you would have handled this task. You can see she kept everything that was in the other slide, but with 2 important differences. She brought the slide down to 3 main pieces of information: indications for LASIK, pros and cons of LASIK, and results of LASIK, and added the other pieces of information in a way they would be triggered easily using the word "for." Using the word "for," she gives audience a hint on how they will use this in their daily practice. She is applying one of the concepts Gabby talked about when addressing adult learning principles: a connection of what they are learning with how they will use it in the daily practice. Let's now take a look how chunking takes place in a lecture. The slide you're watching belongs to a presentation about teaching in the operating room. The graphic shows how I segmented the lecture. On the menu on the side, you can see how I have one section for each of the blocks in my task. With the collapsed menu, the learner can easily find where each block starts. When you click on the little arrow on the side of the menu item, it expands to show all the content. Now you can see all the content of that chunk. In e-learning, there is a second important reason for chunking your lesson. For many of us, time seems to squeeze away, and it is very difficult to find long periods of time to assign to study. In e-learning, many students log in for short periods of time. If there are things they can deal with in short periods of time, they will probably log in more often than if they have to wait until they have long periods of time available. It is very frustrating to log back into a long lecture or activity and don't remember what you have done. This is why we should divide our content in short segments that, when finished, give the learner a sense of accomplishment. This will encourage them to keep coming back. Finally, this diagram shows you a typical set of chunks, models, for a web-based multimedia course, where after the introduction with its goals and objectives, you divide the content in chunks. After each chunk, you have your students exercise on the content using quizzes, discussion forums, or other activities. You end with a big picture and the take-home points. Finally, you may do a global assessment, either formative or summative. Summarizing. Chunking is a way of grouping pieces of information to make them easier to handle by memory. When in doubt about what it means, recall the phone number example. Apply chunking not only to slides, but to your whole presentation or course. Thank you very much for your attention. This is the end of this lecture.